And we are now ready to begin. All set?
Set.
Okay, here we go. Hello and welcome. My name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. I want to thank each of you for supporting our organization and helping us fulfill our education mission by joining this exciting new workshop on historic properties for realtors in the San Diego region. You have the unique opportunity to be the first agents in San Diego to be trained through our Realtor Certification Program. Though this may be your first foray into formal historic preservation training, we hope it allows you to continue to be involved with us after the completion of this series. With your registration, you will receive a one-year membership to the California Preservation Foundation, which entitles you to discounted registration for over 24 online programs and a dozen workshops at historic locations across the state. You will also receive complimentary membership to San Diego's local heritage organization, SOHO, or Save Our Heritage Organization. Today's session will first look at designation in the San Diego region. We will follow that with a presentation on state level and national designation and their impact on the value, marketability, and tax benefits of historic properties. Today you will learn why knowing a historic properties designation is important for agents, the designation process in San Diego, how to determine whether a resource is listed as a local, state, or national resource, how to determine if a property is contributing to a designated district, the differences and implications of designation both for financial incentives and design regulations, and how to use this information to avoid misrepresentation. I'm now going to introduce today's speakers. Maury Van Buren exceeds the Secretary of Interior professional standards for architectural historians. Van Buren earned her master's degree at the Institute for Advanced Architectural Studies, University of York, England, in Conservation Studies in 1984. She has studied archaeology at Cambridge, England, earned her BA from the University of Delaware in 1979, and studied art and architectural history in Vienna, Austria in 1978. She has over 3 decades of experience in heritage tourism, historic designations, and National Register of Historic Places district nominations, tax investment credits, NEPA Section 106 environmental compliance, and a wide range of other expertise. Van Buren is the author of the book House Titles at a Glance, Longstreet Press, 1991, and wrote a monthly column on house styles for Home magazine. William Berg, our second speaker, is a state historian for the California Office of Historic Preservation. He was born in Skokie, Illinois, and grew up in Sacramento's suburbs, attending Humboldt State University and eventually earning a Master of Arts from the Sacramento State University's Public History program. Mr. Berg has authored 6 books about Sacramento history. As president of the Sacramento Old City Association, he advocates for the protection of Sacramento's irreplaceable historic resources. Without further ado, I will now begin the presentation with Maury Van Buren.
Thank you. So let's see, are we going to make this wider?
Sure, I'll increase the size here. Okay.
Let me see if I did it. Sweet. San Diego Historic Designation. I think that one of the most valuable roles and partnerships for any preservation is teaming up with the real estate industry. And that's something that I've been doing for 3 decades, both developing continuing education courses for realtors and courses for appraisers on appraising historic properties. Today, I'd like to give you a basic general overview of historic designations, how to use this information as a tool to market historic properties, and how to avoid misrepresentation. Why is local designation important in San Diego? It is because only properties that are locally designated are eligible for the Mills Act. And here you see an ad for a historic property, and it says, Historic Mills Act designation and low taxes. This indeed is one of the most valuable marketing tools for historic properties, that they are eligible for the Mills Act. So what is the Mills Act and what does it mean? If a property is designated as a historic resource, the property owner enters into a negotiation with the city to restore and maintain that building. And here are two case studies of Mills Act. These are used to market a historic property, and in the very first one, you can see that a home in Mission Hills on Hickory Street sold in June '09 for $1,185,000. In the city of San Diego at the time, the tax rate is 1.1%. So the taxes for this property were about $13,000. But with the Mills Act designation and agreement, the property taxes were only $3,000, which equates to a $10,000 savings annually. So the Mills Act is a very significant savings of money for people that have these historic properties that agree to maintain historic properties. The second case study is kind of a similar one. It is in Mission Hills, a prairie-style building, 1920s. The sales price of $1,475,000. The property tax would be $16,000, but with the Mills Act, it was reduced to $3,263,000, an annual savings of $13,000. So, as you can see, being designated as a historic property is a huge financial incentive for historic buildings. What does it mean? What does it take for a property to be designated as historic? Well, the first thing is the age of the building. In San Diego, it is 45 years old. Typically, for the National Register and the State Register, it's 50 years old, but in San Diego, you first become eligible when it's 45 years old. So what is amazing about that is that a 1970 building would meet the age criteria. So if you're marketing a property in San Diego, which is 1970 or before, it is possibly eligible for nomination as a historic building and to be designated historic. Now, there's something else about this 45-year rule that I want to explain, and that is it is important to understand when you're marketing a property as a tear down that if it's 45 years old, it may be considered eligible as a historic building and therefore not being able to tear it down. Here's a project that I am familiar with. Avoid misrepresentation by marketing a 45-year-old building as a tear down. Here's a property in which it is described for its vintage charm. It's a Spanish home. It has hardwood floors, cove ceilings, beautifully marketed here. And then in the very last line it says, it's great for a first-time home buyer or developer zone for up to 4 units. So indeed a developer did purchase it and did create a plan to tear it down and to build 4 units, but the city said, well, this is a 1936 building, and tearing it down goes against the city ordinance. So just because something is zoned commercial, just because something is zoned for 4 units, does not mean that it can be torn down if it qualifies as a historic building. Oops, I'm going to go back to integrity. So we mentioned that age was one of the criteria for historic property. Another one is integrity. And what does integrity mean? Well, I would like to tell you the first three things I look for to determine if a property has integrity. First of all, has it been moved from its original site? No matter how grand it is, if a building has been moved from its site, it is typically not listed. There are some exceptions to that rule, but in general, being moved from its original site means it will not be designated. The second is, does it have additions that alter the historic shape? Was it a one-story building that became 2 stories? Does it have a huge wing to it? What are the additions? Because that can determine whether or not it has its integrity. And then the third thing I typically look for is, does it have its original windows? Does it have its original roof material? If it's mission clay tile roof, is it still mission clay tile roof, or is it now wood shingle? And does it have its original wall material and wall texture? One of the things that I've noticed that the City of San Diego staff people look at is, on a stucco building, does it have the same stucco texture? Because if the texture goes from being a rough texture to being a smooth texture, that is a visual clue to that being an addition. So if we look at this elevation and we talk about integrity, what are the additions on the elevation? Notice that the original part has a red clay tile roof, and over to the left you'll see a shed roof and an addition. Hey, thanks for moving that. I want to get that guy out of the way. Jonathan, can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I moved it out of the way.
Yeah, I think it's been in the way for a lot of my slides, and I tried to play around with it, but since I'm full screen, I didn't access it. I think it'll be okay, and we'll just pick up from here under integrity again. Okay? Okay. Integrity. What are the additions on this elevation? As a real estate professional, you train your eye to determine whether a historic building is original or whether it has additions. Now, just because it has an addition doesn't rule it out, but it is something to be taken into consideration. If you look up on the second story, you see 2 windows and there is a door which leads out, and that is a later addition, and there's a shed addition to the left as well. It was a porch which was later enclosed. So we talked about age and we talked about integrity, and now let's briefly mention architectural style, because it is the architectural style that attracts the buyer of the building. It's the characteristics, the original features. On the left, we have a Queen Anne Victorian house, and whereas we don't have many Victorian houses in San Diego, we do have a few, and they're quite grand. This one has fish scale shingles, it has a wraparound porch, it has a turret, and also look at the windows. The windows provide a clue to the date it was built. The large one pane over one pane has a reflection of the glass making technology in the 1880s. And when we see these 1 over 1 windows, it's a clue that the building dates from the 1880s or after. And on the right, we have a Craftsman bungalow, and it was very well marketed in the ad. It's a classic Craftsman, and the agent has put the name of the district. It's in the Burlingame historic district. I'll show you how to find out what district it is. And the property is also Mills Act. So the one interesting thing about the Mills Act tax savings is it passes on from one owner to the next. So it is quite a great selling tool for someone who is selling a property to be able to say, hey, your taxes are going to be greatly reduced if you buy this property versus a property that doesn't have the Mills Act. So the correct architectural description, the identification of it being in a historic district, and the use of the Mills Act. So in San Diego, there is a document which talks about all the master builders in town and the master architects. And here is one. He built mid-century modern houses. And here he is sitting in this amazing staircase. And to the right is his wife in the 1960s. And she was also an artist. And so you can access this information on the City of San Diego website. And here it is. A very interesting marketing tool. Look it up and you will be able to show the property and to describe it as being the work of a master. Here is the website, Biographies of Established Masters, City of San Diego, and the link to typing it in. So what's interesting about a lot of these historic properties is there's so much information already on them. And my goal today will be to talk a little bit about the database of information and how to tap into it and how to use it to market historic properties. There, thank you. Whoops. Okay. So here is the City of San Diego's website, and this is one I hope that you will all become very familiar with. There's a lot of information here. So how do you find out if a building is designated as historic by the Historic Resource Board? It's referred to as HRB. And here is their website, and if you just peruse it, you'll see that there's a lot of information, but at the very bottom on the left-hand side, there's a red arrow, and it says Register of Historic Resources, and we're going to tap onto that. And here it pulls up every resource that has been registered in the City of San Diego is listed here. On the left-hand side is the HRB number, and then it says whether it's individual or if it's part of a district, and the name of the historic site or the district. The APN is the parcel number on the tax map, and then you have the street number and street address, the zip code, and the date it was designated. And this page, a lot of the stuff was designated in 1972, so these were amongst the earliest buildings. And it says who the architect is, Irving Gill, who is one of the master architects. Then it says if it's eligible for the Mills Act. This is an extremely worthwhile database of information. There's no reason why you should not be able to find out if a property has already been listed. If it has, then you can tap into the report and you can find out all about it. You can find out the architectural style, the date of construction, and just incredibly valuable wealth of information on marketing historic properties. If you want to be an expert in marketing historic properties, this information is going to help you. So there's another database of information on historic properties in San Diego. And once again, you go to the City of San Diego's website. And we're going to tap into the California Historic Resource Database. But if you look at the very bottom, I just want you to have this email address of the city staff. I find them to be very helpful if you have questions. And so you can just type in historic resources at sandiego.gov, and they're there to help you. And don't tell them I sent you. No, I'm just kidding. So here's the California Historic Resource Database. And this was kind of an effort between the State Historic Preservation Office and local cities to upload and have a database of all of their surveys so that if there is a resource, let's say, for example, in South Park or in North Park or in East Village, which is not actually listed as a historic resource, it may have a survey. And a survey is when a professional goes up and down every single road, photographs the building, describes the building, and here is also a great database of information for you as a real estate agent for properties that aren't already designated but might be eligible to be designated or might not be eligible to be designated. And here is a database on that information. And I am having such a hard time advancing this slide. And this is a little form you fill out. You fill out the address, the parcel number, etc., etc. You can see that it will tell you all the different architectural styles. You can survey by year, by original use, by historic context. So, wow, you have all this information right on your laptop, and become familiar with it and embrace it, because your taxpayers' money went to create this, why not use it? And who better to use it than the real estate industry? I did it. There's also another great organization besides the city that's helpful, and that is SOHO. And SOHO is a nonprofit organization, Save Our Heritage organization, and I have found them to be a very professional group. They can help you research buildings. They can give you advice. It's a great organization. Every single real estate agent in town should be actively involved in SOHO. I can't say enough good things about this organization, and I'm just glad to hear that membership is given as part of this historic designation, because they need your support, and in return, they will support you. So one of the documents that I have found helpful is the Research Your House. And so SOHO has this huge article on how to research your house, on how to step by step find out about a building. And there's a lot of information here, and there's a huge learning curve. And so that's their website. Here is the article on the SOHO website, www.sohosandiego.org, and you can see all the different tools that they have. Become involved and volunteer with them. You will learn so much. So now I would like to talk about the designation process. And on the City of San Diego's website is this guide to creating historic research reports and guidelines. And if you have a property owner or purchaser that wants to do the Mills Act and that wants to designate a building, I kind of would like for you to understand what is involved in designation, because it is a huge process. I've just finished one. Sometimes they're 40 pages, sometimes they're 100 pages, but we're going to go through what is involved so that you have an understanding. I am a preservation consultant, and I think that it's valuable to have a preservation consultant involved. And I want to talk to you a little bit about the cost, just so you have an idea. To do a historic designation, it costs anywhere from $3,500 to $10,000. And at first I thought that was a lot of money, but having done it, I certainly realize why it is that much expense. And in addition to hiring a consultant, the city also will charge you, I think it's like $1,185. The property owner has to pay the city to do a historic designation. So yes, you do get tax credits, but there are expenses involved in doing a designation. Now, it is possible for a property owner to do a historic designation themselves, but it probably take a year or two. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. Just be realistic here. So, first of all, there is certain criteria for designation, and this criteria reflects the National Register criteria, but it is different as well. It's not a one-to-one parallel. Okay, so the first criteria is that it reflects special elements of the city, neighborhood, historical, cultural, political, engineering, and landscape development. The second is that it is identified with persons or events significant locally. One interesting project I worked on was a house that is significant for its history in the civil rights movement and the gay rights. There were two men that lived in a particular house that were gay activists. They helped create the Gay Center. They were really extraordinary in the civil rights movement locally, and so that would be under B. C is the architectural style. We've talked about bungalows, we talked about Victorian, the Spanish eclectic style, et cetera, et cetera. Notable work of a master. So under D, you would use the document that lists all the masters, and you would use that to justify that one. So E is that it has been determined eligible for the National Register or listed on the National Register. So just because it's listed doesn't mean it's a Mills Act. You still have to create this report, but this would be how you would justify that it's eligible. And then number F is a finite group of resources related to one another in the form of a historic district. So if it's a district, it can also be. So that's the criteria. A little bit different from National Register criteria. And the website for the San Diego Historic Resource Board talks about each one of these criteria and gives you an example. So this is one that's significant in architectural development. You can see it's a bungalow, which was really popular in the 1920s. And this is one, just because it's old, this says resources not eligible. Age of a resource alone is not sufficient to meet the criteria for designation. Here's one in which is designated for the style, the type, the period, and method of construction. Yet another bungalow and how it's justified. I'm going to show you a little bit about what the report looks like. So that's the criteria. And the first thing you do is there's two kind of survey forms that you fill out that are downloaded from the state website. And one is the primary record, and other is the building record. And these are filled out. And then you have to support it with documentation. So I'd like to now go through the list of all the documents that are required as part of the designation. Are you ready? Here goes. Okay, first of all, you have the primary record I just showed you. Then you have a locational map, which is typically a USGS quad map. Then you have a sketch map of the property and continuation sheets which outline how the building is significant, whether it has its integrity, and what its historic context is. And then you have the attachments. There's the assessor's record, the notice of completion, the water and sewage records from the time it was built. You have to have every single building permit. You create a site plan and a footprint. You have the county lot and block map, and you copy all previous surveys that are done. Then you do a chain of title from the beginning of the building all the way up for a current time, and you go to the city directory research and you do the city directory of every single person that lived in the house, what they did for a living, and then you have a copy of the deed from the date of construction. After that, you create a city engineering map, USGS maps, the original subdivision maps, and Sanborn fire insurance maps from 1886, from 1906, 21, 40, 50, and 56. Then you have the historical and transitional photograph, and you do current photographs of the document. Just want to give you an idea of what is involved in researching one of these documents, because it's quite comprehensive, fun, but quite comprehensive. Oh, here I included a Sanborn map on the left. This is a 1950 Sanborn fire insurance map of a property. And it's significant because you can tell what the original footprint of the building was in 1950. So if the footprint has changed, you can determine the alterations. And just one more document I decided to throw in was a residential building record. And this tells you the date of construction. It also, on the second sheet, has a floor plan. It has every single addition that was done and the materials, and provides you with a lot of information as well. So once you have created this document with all these maps and all this historical information, you then submit it to the City of San Diego, and the staff will make a review of the document and a site visit. And they will make a recommendation. And in that recommendation, they will say, you know, we say this is eligible, we say this is not eligible. And this recommendation and the documentation goes to a historic resource board. The board is made up of, I believe, 11 citizens. And these people represent real estate, they represent architecture, they represent history and archaeology, they represent historic preservation, all different categories, and they review the designation. And they may look at the designation and they may ask for more information, or they may automatically list it, or they may say it's not eligible. And they listen to what the staff has to say. They will sometimes go against the staff, but most likely they will not. So that concludes my presentation about local designations. And I want to say that there is a lot of information here on this website and in SOHO and in the different historical organizations that you can use to accurately market historic properties, to market them in their best light, and to educate the public. It is very important to avoid misrepresentation. Keep in mind that anything that is 45 years old is possibly eligible for designation, and just because it's zoned commercial doesn't mean a new buyer can demolish it, because if it's historic, that's up for debate, and be very careful, because should they purchase a property that you marketed as a tear down and they're not able to tear it down, and they spent $800,000 on it, who are they going to come back to? Unfortunately, they're going to say, you said it was a tear down and I can't tear it down. So As we go forth, this is a great opportunity for learning. You will learn so much about historic buildings, and as you learn them, I hope that you will learn to love them and to preserve them and to market them accurately. Thank you for listening.
All right, thank you. I'll go ahead and move on to my first slide. I work for the National, I'm sorry, I'm just making sure my mic works. I work for California Office of Historic Preservation and in the registration unit, and there are 4 programs that we administer. In addition to the California Register of Historical Resources and the National Register of Historic Places, we also administer the California Historical Landmarks and California Points of Historical Interest program. Those last 2 use a different set of criteria than most of what we're discussing, so I'm going to focus today's discussion on California Register and National Register, and you'll see photos throughout the presentation of different properties throughout the greater Bay Area, including a bit farther south than I think some of you are. I'd like to take a moment to discuss levels of significance. We've been hearing different things about local listing, state listing, national. There are several different programs. There's listing in local registers, there's listing in the California Register, and listing in the National Register. But those are irrespective of what's called the level of significance of the nomination, which means how important was that property within its context. Was it significant primarily to the city or county or to the entire state where it's located, or was this a property that was influential throughout the entire United States? And there can be locally listed properties that are nationally significant, and the vast majority of properties listed in the National Register, about 90%, are locally significant. Of the remaining 10%, about 9% are at the state level of significance. So only about 1 in 100 National Register properties is nationally significant. I wanted to find one that was kind of unique as an example, and you can see the big Zeppelin on the right. That's the USS Macon. It was essentially an airborne aircraft carrier, and it crashed off the coast of Monterey County. It's an extraordinarily significant vessel in the history of aviation, and it's an archaeological nomination. Probably not something you're going to deal with as a realtor, but that's an example of the kind of property that we'd call nationally significant, not just listed in the National Register. The property on the left is the Palo Alto Medical Clinic. It's primarily a locally significant property. It's significant to the history of Palo Alto and the development of medicine in the East Bay. There's also, the South Bay, and there's also some murals on the inside which are artistically important to the building, but not really to the level of national significance or even state level of significance. But they are all equal in terms of protection and the way they're considered, and what that means essentially is that they're treated as historic resources for purposes of California. They're not, however, limited from private property owner action. That's something that comes from the local government, because local governments have the power to do things like issue building permits, demolition permits, design review, etc. I wanted to compare the California Register and the National Register. The National Register was created in 1966, and it is the program that we work with the most. You can see at the bottom there, last year we reviewed and listed 56 National Register properties. We listed 0 California Register properties last year. We were reviewing 1 in 2014, and I think 2012 we had a particularly banner year for California Register. We added 6 properties. So because the criteria are similar but not exact, there are only certain circumstances where we recommend California Register listing over National Register. There's kind of a perception that California Register listing is easier, but that's not really the case. How it works, just the difference in process. For a California Register nomination, it's required that you submit a copy of the nomination to local government first and then wait 90 days. You send the registered mail receipt and the nomination to our office. We review it, essentially make sure that the nomination is complete, that it makes sense, all the components are there, and then it's scheduled for review by the State Historical Resources Commission. That runs on a 90-day cycle. There's 4 meetings a year. They're publicly noticed. The public has the opportunity to comment. And once it's reviewed by the commission, once it's signed, they vote on it and says, yes, this is eligible, it's immediately listed in the California Register. The difference for National Register is that you can send the nomination directly to our office. It doesn't require review by local government first. It's reviewed by staff. We see if it's complete, if it makes sense. It's reviewed by the commission on that same 90-day cycle. Still a public process. The nominating party is notified when that meeting is going to happen, as well as the owner of the property, the mayor of the local government. If it's a certified local government, if there's a local preservation program, we notify them as well as the county board of supervisors. The idea is it's an inclusive public process. After that review, if it's passed by the commission, then the nomination is sent to the keeper, and it's usually about a 45-day wait before we find out whether or not it's been listed. And usually, if it's been sent to the keeper, it will be listed. There are occasionally, very rarely, times when a nomination is returned, but we try to be pretty particular about what we send so we don't get anything back from them saying, sorry, this didn't pass our muster. Roberta talked a little bit about the different criteria, but didn't really identify them. They're lettered in the case of the National Register and numbered in the case of the California Register. Criterion A, or 1, is about events, things that happens in conjunction with this property or at this property. There needs to be a direct connection between the events and the property in order to establish significance. Criterion B, or California Register Criterion 2, is about individuals, people who are important to our history, and the thing that makes them significant has to have a direct association with the property. If, for example, the building is associated with the past mayor of a city, if that city's city hall, where she was the mayor, is still around, then the city hall might be the more appropriate property to nominate in conjunction with her significance as the mayor. But if that city hall isn't around anymore and that building is the last remaining or the most significant remaining property association with that person, then it can be nominated. But if there's not really a connection between that person and what makes them significant, then it's hard to nominate under Criterion B. Criterion C is about architecture or design or craftsmanship. It's Criterion 3 in California Register. And it can be about the work of master architects, but it isn't strictly necessary to identify the name of the architect. If you can demonstrate that it's the work of a master craftsperson, whether or not you know who it is, it can still be nominated. Essentially, if you are saying it was designed by this architect, it is expected you'll provide documentation to demonstrate that that is so. And if you can identify the architect and their other works and what makes them a master architect, it's easier to make the case than a property that was designed by an anonymous architect and having to have more detail into what makes it significant. Criterion D is about archaeology, subsurface properties, or even properties that are underwater, like the wreck of the Macon that I mentioned earlier. The limitations of listing are that public-funded projects may be subject to review. If you're receiving funds from a government agency and those funds are being used to demolish or damage a potentially historic property, whether or not it's listed, then those funds can be jeopardized unless you can figure out a way to use those funds to restore the property. And local government might treat listed properties as historic properties, but that varies widely by municipality. They might treat a property that's listed in the National Register as locally listed, or at the very least treated as a historic property for purposes of CEQA. Private parties can object outright to a nomination. If someone submits a National Register nomination for another person's property and the owner of the property objects, doesn't want it listed, it cannot be listed over their objection. It can be determined eligible, but it can't be listed. That applies for National Register and California Register, although there's one consequence to that I'll get into later. In the case of a district where there are multiple property owners, each property owner gets a vote, and if a majority of property owners object object to listing, it cannot be listed over their objection. But if less than a majority object, it can still be listed. Now, if a property is theoretically, it's going to be eligible, it meets the criteria, it has integrity, but the owner objects, it can still be determined eligible. And any property that's listed in the National Register is automatically listed in the California Register. Properties that are determined eligible for the California Register, whether it's through the result of environmental review like Section 106 review or a nomination that the owner objected to, it still results in listing in the California Register. And primarily the purpose of that determination of eligibility is protection from government action, that the government is going to have to treat this as a historic resource for purposes of CEQA, NEPA, Section 106, but in terms of private property owner action, it doesn't really limit what they can do. These are two examples, Century 21 Theater in Santa Clara County and the Chung May Home for Boys in Contra Costa County, that were properties that were determined eligible for listing in the National Register and would have been listed if not for the owner's objection. Some of the previous presenters talked a little bit about historic integrity. Essentially, a property has to be able to convey what makes it significant. Now, what makes it significant varies. In the case of a property that is significant primarily for its architecture, the threshold for integrity is generally higher. If you're saying this building has great architecture and workmanship, that workmanship needs to be demonstrated in what remains there. The material should be original, it should be in its original shape. If it's too far gone, too far decayed, it may no longer retain eligibility. And I use this example, the Bayshore Roundhouse, because you may not be able to tell, but a large portion of this roundhouse, about half of it, was destroyed in a fire. But this is not a high-style architect-designed building. This is a utilitarian working building used as a roundhouse for railroad locomotives. So even though it's in a damaged state, it's still very clear from its surroundings, from what survives, from what's there, how the building was used. You can comprehend its function by looking at it and walking around the site. You can see the whisker tracks, even the piping for steam to feed a locomotive, to help superheat a locomotive, or the piping for air compressors or to run tools. A lot of that infrastructure is still there, and that helps convey the importance of the property as a working place. And so just because a property is damaged doesn't mean it's not eligible, but there's still a threshold, there's still a standard, and if a property is too far gone, it may no longer be eligible, which brings me to the subject of removal. A property owner can't simply say, I no longer wish to be listed in the National Register or California Register. The only conditions where that removal can happen is either if the property is destroyed or it's damaged to the point where it no longer retains sufficient integrity. This is the Donner Houghton House in Santa Clara County that was destroyed by fire and thus removed after demolition was complete. And the other way you can remove a property is if the nomination is later proven to be inaccurate. If it was nominated based on inaccurate or false information and you can demonstrate later that that was the case, then a property can be removed. But those are really the only conditions that you can remove a property from those registers. In terms of state and federal incentives, some of the other presenters already spoke about the California Historic Building Code. There is also a federal tax credit. This is generally for commercial properties rather than single-family homes, but it does come up in the case of properties that started out as commercial buildings but are converted to residential or to condos. Federal tax credits is generally only for rentals, but one example of a residential property that started out as commercial, a fairly recent tax credit project, is Vallejo City Hall and the Masonic Temple in Solano County. It was obviously a city hall and Masonic Temple, and today they're residential units aimed at young artists and people with limited incomes but with creative backgrounds. And so this kind of property, this kind of project, we're starting to see come up as a potential tax credit project. And if the state tax credit passes, then not only would it be something you can add to a federal tax credit program to add even more of an incentive, but at least the way that the last bill was written, and hopefully a future bill would be, is that you could also use it for single-family homes, and that will really change the game for historic properties and their nominations. And so a realtor who works primarily with historic properties will start to encounter this if it passes. There's also FEMA consideration. Properties listed in the National Register typically get a higher priority for, in the case of natural disasters. And it's obviously something we take seriously in earthquake country, in tsunami country. And so places like Napa, we're definitely looking at some nominations that are coming through that haven't been listed yet, but part of what we're looking for is were these damaged by the earthquake, and then of course were properties that were damaged, properties that were already listed. As far as finding out where these properties can be researched, the NPS Focus database, and there will be a link in the last slide of this presentation, is your best resource. It's National Park Service. You can search by name, you can search by state, city, and county. There isn't really a way to search by address, which is kind of a limitation, so it takes a little paging, but especially for smaller cities, the number of National Register listed property is usually pretty small. It can get a little more complex if you're dealing with cities the size of Oakland or San Francisco, and that has a lot of National Register properties, but it's mostly, if you're a little methodical about it, or if you have some information to go on, if you suspect a property is listed, it's not too hard to get through. And then there is an information center in Rohnert Park. It's associated with Sonoma State University, and here's the contact information. I assume you'll be able to get this information after the presentation as well. If you want to do research about a property, find out if it's listed in the California Register as a result of Section 106 review or the result of direct nomination, you can usually find it through the information center pretty reliably, as well as find out other assessments that have been done on the property. Now, a point about property values, there are a lot of myths and rumors about what listing in local registers and the National Register do to property values, and there have also been quite a few studies done on it. And the general assumption is that it has a stabilizing effect on property values. They don't jump as high during real estate booms, but neither do they fall as hard during real estate crashes. So during the recession, places that were historic neighborhoods tended to be a little more resilient to losses in property value, but they didn't go as high as part of the boom. And part of that is the way that historic properties are viewed by different segments of the real estate market. Somebody who's looking for a plot of land and isn't too worried about what's built on top of it is going to be discouraged by the presence of a historic building because they can't just do what they want with the land. But someone who's interested in a building type, that's interested specifically in historic buildings for their aesthetic value or for their potential, is going to be more interested. So what happens is the land underneath the building gets less valuable, but because the property has been formally listed, that's third-party, objective proof that this place is special, it's unique, it's worthwhile, and that raises the value of the building on the land. And that generally these neighborhoods increase in value at a greater rate than other comparable neighborhoods that aren't listed. There's also a recent study done by the National Trust for Historic Preservation called Older, Smaller, Better, and this is particularly worth paying attention to within the context of the Bay Area and many cities that are converting commercial spaces, finding new roles for their buildings, for their downtowns, and many of them are becoming much more residential. So things like residential lofts in old downtowns, in old commercial buildings, are definitely going to be part of the residential for sale real estate market for the young generation of millennials who are very interested in living in downtowns and living in these kind of cool industrial spaces or these very accessible, very walkable downtown spaces, and not necessarily big city downtowns, but also small town downtowns that have charm, that have accessibility, that have connections to regional transit systems. And one of the things the study found, just as kind of an interesting note, is they tracked cell phone calls and where are cell phone signals coming from on Friday nights, on Saturday nights in cities like Seattle and San Francisco. What they found is late at night on the weekends, they're coming from blocks that have lots of old buildings versus blocks that have new buildings, because these older buildings tend to be breeding grounds for more cutting-edge businesses where the risks involved in something like a nightclub or a new restaurant is too high for the investment factors of a new building, but an old building that has a lower margin, those kind of new industries can thrive and creative communities can thrive. So that's part of the real potential of old buildings, and it is going to become more and more of a factor for the residential housing market. But there's also the traditional historic property customer. They're looking for a classic. This is the same sort of person, in other words, who collects classic cars, who wants a Model T, who wants a Mustang, who has money to spend on a place that is beautiful and in a beautiful place. They appreciate historic neighborhoods, they value the aesthetics of the buildings, and also, like those millennials that I mentioned, many of them want to live in a place that's more walkable, and many of the Bay Area's traditional neighborhoods tend to be very walkable, good sidewalks, mature tree growth, and again, walking distance to businesses and to transit. They're also very attractive to fixers and flippers, people who watch a lot of home and garden TV and see people fixing up old homes and turning them around, or they just want to do it as a hobby. And listing has appeal for them, not only because of the potential incentives. In many cases, you can't use the California Historic Building Code unless a property is listed. And if a city doesn't have its own historic preservation program, listing in the National Register, California Register gives you the option. And these are a couple of examples of peninsula properties of this sort. And the kind of customer that they can attract is a particular one. It's not the same sort of customer who wants to do a tear down and build a McMansion. It's a particular customer. If you have historic properties in your portfolio or in your market, these are the kind of properties you're going to want to show to someone who's looking for a place that has charm, that has accessibility, that has that established neighborhood value. They're not for everyone, but for this historic property customer, nothing else will do. These are some useful links. I'm sorry, the City of Rockford study link URL there is a little lengthy, but it also has the other links I mentioned and my contact information. If you have any other questions about National Register or California Register nomination, please feel free to contact me. And thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, William. That's perfect timing. So we have about 15 minutes for question and answers. If anybody has any questions, now is your time. We still have 3 of the speakers present, including myself, so or as well as myself. So click on the raise your hand symbol, or you can also type in your question in the chat box. I'm going to wait around here just for a second just to see if any questions come in. I know we covered a lot of information today. We tried to breeze through a lot of information, but I'm sure you'll find the links that I send you by the end of today especially helpful. There will be maps. I'll include these links that William has included, and also anything else that was presented, in addition to a PDF copy of the entire presentation. So what I'm looking at the chat box right now. I don't see any questions come in. But if you have them, now is your last chance. And I don't see anybody raising their hands. So it seems like, oh, I see one question coming in. So we'll wait until that's in. Still waiting on this question. Gina, if you're still typing your question in, oh, here it is. Oh, it's a comment actually.
Uh-oh.
And so she's asking if she should always log in as a guest. So this is for everybody's information. You're welcome to log in as a guest. All you have to do is type in your full name so we can confirm that you're present. If you have trouble logging in, it's possibly because you may not have the password, but we have a list of everybody's passwords. So all you have to do is email me and ask for the password. You'll need that password also to take your quiz if you miss any sessions. And if you had the password, I can troubleshoot it for you, and I'll try to log in with your name to see if it works. But my guess is it's possible that you may have the wrong password, or I'll figure it out for you. So in any case, if you have problems logging in, you always have the option of joining as a guest. Just type in your whole name. So if, I think we have two other possible questions. Jeffrey wants to know about the quiz. So Jeffrey, if anybody present is unable to attend any of the sessions, whether it's part 2 or 3 or 4, what you do is you receive the recording for this session, and you watch the recording, and you take a 10-question quiz. You're not required to take the quiz if you're present for the live session, but you are required to take the quiz if you're present, or if you're not present for the session and you have to watch the recording. So for the people that have scheduling issues for the Wednesdays, or they can't make a certain day, there's always the option of watching the recording and then taking the 10-question quiz. You have to pass the quiz with 70% completion rate. You have 4 or 6 chances to complete the quiz with that grade, and you will proceed on to the next session if you complete 70%. And if you logged in late, it depends on how late you are. So if you're more than 15 minutes late, you might need to take the quiz. And I usually confirm that by hand by looking at the logs. So I will let you know if you're not marked as present. James has a question for our speakers, and he wants to know how can and how does sustainability play a role in considering older development over newer development?
I could respond to it if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, I just typed, so the greenest building is one that's already built. It's kind of a truism in the preservation community, and that's for several reasons. First of all is that the energy investment of building a building is worth decades of its actual energy consumption while the building is in use. And so the embodied energy value of that building is worth taking into consideration, as is waste material from construction by new buildings. About half the contents of our landfills are either demolished bits of old buildings or the waste materials from new construction. And there is a pretty advanced science these days of how to rehab existing buildings, and that Rehab Right booklet that Oakland produced, and also Retrofit Right, which is a companion volume to it, really were just the beginning, but they give a lot of advice on the relatively simple and very often very cost-effective ways to reduce losses of energy and to increase energy efficiency of an older home without losing the historic appearance.
Great. That's yeah, good to mention, and thanks for mentioning that, William. Is the embodied energy of a building always means that the greenest building is the one that's already present. So a lot of the calculations do take into account the waste materials and also the new construction materials. And it looks like Jeffrey is asking about the dates, and I apologize, but it's not 11/18 for the third part of the session. It's 11/19, which is a Wednesday. So just so everybody knows, that date will be changed on the calendar, but it should be 11/19 Wednesday at 2:30 p.m. for part 3. Part 2 is up next, and that will be November 5th, Wednesday, November 5th. Caitlin Harvey will be speaking, along with possibly another speaker on architectural styles in the Bay Area. We'll have a sort of a quick fun quiz. It's not a graded quiz, but just to gauge people's knowledge of architectural styles. We'll show some pictures and possibly quiz you on what you think that style is. So if there are no further questions, I don't think I see any further questions other than possibly one from James coming in. We'll have about 7 minutes if we need to address any further questions. But if there are no further questions, I'm going to move on to the evaluation. Please do let us know how this session went today. This allows us to improve our programs. On the right-hand side, you'll find some links to the downloads for today's presentation, and also a link to the National Register database that William mentioned. On the bottom of the screen, there are spots for written responses. So if you have any written comments or anything, we would love to hear them. When you complete this multiple choice evaluation, please scroll up to the top of the page and click on the submit response button. That way we are sure that we've received your feedback. And I look forward to joining with you on the 5th of November. You are now 1/4 of the way through the program, so congratulations. And once you complete all 4 sessions, we'll be issuing you a certificate online. Pretty much happens automatically as soon as you are marked complete for each of the 4 sessions. I wanted to send words of thanks to each of our speakers today, Roberta, Betty, William, and Caitlin. Thank you all for your support of the foundation, and by registering with this program, you're supporting a nonprofit foundation that advocates for the protection of historic places in the state. So we appreciate your support and look forward to working with you in the coming 1.5 months to complete the program. Don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions about it at any time. Thanks again, everybody.